Everything you think you know about the Cajuns is only half true. Yes, they came from French exiles. Yes, they were expelled by the British in one of history's cruelest deportations. But the DNA tells a second story running underneath the first one. A story of two peoples merging into one, hidden for centuries behind French surnames and Catholic Church records. This is what the genome actually says. To understand what the DNA reveals, you first have to understand the story everyone already believes. Because the truth doesn't replace that story, it grows out of it. In the early 1600s, a small wave of French Catholic settlers crossed the Atlantic and landed on a peninsula of marshy, tide-swept land that would come to be called Acadia, later known as Nova Scotia. The land reminded them of home, of the salt marshes near La Rochelle in western France, where many of these founding families had come from. They were farmers mostly, people who understood how to hold back the sea with dikes and turn drowned earth into fields. And there weren't many of them. Historians and geneticists now agree the entire founding population of Acadia came from somewhere around 50 core French families. 50. Not 50,000, not 500. 50 families form the genetic root from which hundreds of thousands of people alive today, in Canada, in Louisiana, and scattered across the world ultimately descend. For a century and a half, these families grew, intermarried, and built a distinct culture on that Nova Scotian coastline. Then, in 1755, everything they had built was taken from them in an act of forced removal, remembered as the Grand Dérangement, the Great Upheaval. British colonial forces, suspicious of Acadian loyalties during a period of imperial conflict, ordered the wholesale expulsion of the Acadian population. Farms were burned, families were split apart, loaded onto different ships bound for different destinations, some sent to the American colonies, some to the Caribbean, some all the way back across the ocean to France itself, and some tragically lost at sea before they ever reached land. It was, by any modern definition, an act of ethnic cleansing, and it scattered a tightly bonded, genetically distinct population across half the Atlantic world in the span of a few brutal years. Out of that scattering came a new destination that no Acadian had originally chosen for themselves, Louisiana. Beginning around 1763 and continuing for the next several decades, groups of displaced Acadians began drifting south, settling along the Mississippi River and the winding bayous of La Fourche, Teche, and Vermilion in the southern part of the territory. The word Acadian, spoken with a Louisiana French accent, softened and shifted over generations into something new, Cajun. And in the isolation of the swamps and prairies of southern Louisiana, something remarkable happened. The community didn't dissolve into the wider population around it. It held together. Cajuns married Cajuns. Families stayed close, physically and socially, for generation after generation, creating one of the most genetically distinct population groups in all of North America. This is where the science begins, but not in the way you'd expect. The first real clue that something unusual was written into Cajun DNA didn't come from a genealogist digging through old church records. It came from a doctor noticing a pattern he couldn't explain. At Tulane University in New Orleans, a gastroenterologist began seeing something that shouldn't have been happening. Young patients, some barely into their 30s, walking into his clinic with colorectal cancer, a disease that typically doesn't show up until people are well into their 50s or 60s. And there was a pattern in the names attached to these young cases: French surnames, Acadian surnames, Cajun surnames. When he went looking through the existing scientific literature on the Cajun population, he found something that confirmed his suspicion in the most unsettling way possible. Cajuns had already been identified, decades earlier, as what geneticists call a founder population, a group with an unusually high frequency of certain inherited genetic diseases, because their entire gene pool traced back to such a small number of original ancestors. That term, founder population, is the key to everything the DNA eventually revealed. Here's how it works. When a large genetically diverse group breaks off into a small subgroup and that subgroup becomes isolated, whether by geography, culture, religion, or forced circumstance, and continues to reproduce mostly within itself for many generations, the genetic diversity of that new group collapses down to whatever variants happen to exist in the small number of founding individuals. If one of those founders happened to carry a rare disease-causing mutation, that mutation doesn't stay rare. It gets passed down, generation after generation, through a population that keeps marrying its own cousins, distant or otherwise, until what was once an extraordinarily uncommon mutation becomes disproportionately, sometimes shockingly common within that specific group. This is exactly what happened to the Cajuns, and it's exactly what happened, for entirely separate historical reasons, to Ashkenazi Jewish populations in Europe. Geneticists studying both groups have found the same underlying pattern. A population descended from a small number of founders, geographically or culturally isolated for centuries, developing an unusually high carrier rate for specific inherited diseases that are otherwise rare in the general population. For the Cajuns, that list of diseases reads like a catalog of the genome's hidden fingerprints. Tay-Sachs disease, the same devastating neurological disorder associated with Ashkenazi Jewish populations, appears at elevated rates among Cajuns descended from Akkadian founders. Usher syndrome, a condition that causes both hearing loss and progressive blindness, shows up with striking frequency, traced to a specific mutation carried by the original founding families. Friedreich's ataxia, a progressive disorder affecting movement and coordination, appears again and again in Akkadian medical records. And Fanconi anemia, a rare bone marrow failure disorder, has been documented repeatedly within this same tightly wound genetic community. None of this is coincidence, and none of it is random bad luck. It's mathematics, written into flesh and blood. When researchers began mapping these mutations back through Akkadian genealogies, tracing the DNA of patients in Louisiana, clinics back through centuries of church baptismal records and marriage certificates, they kept arriving at the same conclusion. Every single line led back to Nova Scotia. Every single line led back to those same 50 founding families. The genome doesn't lie, and the genome was telling researchers something the historical record had always claimed but never proven with this level of precision. That the Cajun people really are, biologically, one enormous extended family, descended overwhelmingly from a genetic bottleneck that occurred 400 years ago on the other side of a continent. Before going further, it helps to sit with just how unusual it is for a doctor's clinical hunch and a genealogist's family tree obsession to end up validating each other decades apart, using completely different methods, arriving at the exact same buried history. That convergence is what turned this from a regional curiosity into something researchers now treat as a genuinely significant case study in human population genetics. The scale of this discovery is worth sitting with for a moment. Southern Louisiana's Akkadian parishes are home to somewhere between 500,000 and 700,000 people who identify as Cajun today. That is not a small, forgettable regional community. That is a population roughly the size of a mid-sized American city. And every single person within it, statistically speaking, traces the overwhelming majority of their ancestry back to a founding group smaller than the graduating class of a single high school. Geneticists rarely get to study a founder population this large, this well-documented, and this cooperative, willing to submit blood samples and family histories in the name of understanding a disease pattern that was quietly costing young parents their lives decades before it should have. What began as a medical mystery in a Tulane clinic turned into one of the richest founder population datasets available anywhere in North America, and researchers have been mining it for insight ever since. Insight that extends far beyond cancer and into the deeper question of where these people actually came from. Doctors studying deafblindness in French-Canadian populations in Quebec found something that deepened the picture even further. When they traced a specific mutation in a gene called USH1C, a gene responsible for one form of Usher syndrome, they discovered it wasn't confined to Louisiana at all. The same mutation, the same genetic fingerprint, showed up in French-Canadian families in Quebec who had never set foot in Acadia and had no documented Acadian ancestry in their family trees. And yet the DNA told a different story than the paperwork did. It meant that at some point, in some way lost to written history, Acadian bloodlines had quietly mixed into the Quebec population too, leaving behind a genetic signature that survived even after the historical connection had been forgotten. This single discovery reshaped how geneticists think about founder populations in eastern North America altogether. It proved that DNA can preserve a truth that documents cannot, that a mutation traveling silently through centuries of marriages can outlast every paper trail meant to record where a family actually came from. It also raised an uncomfortable question that researchers are still working through today. How many other supposedly separate French-Canadian communities, spread out across Quebec, New Brunswick, and the wider Acadian diaspora, are quietly connected by threads of shared ancestry that written genealogy simply never captured? Population geneticists studying the broader Quebec founder population have found their own version of this pattern, tracing regional kinship structures around the Gaspé Peninsula and the Saguenay region back to founder effects that predate the formal colonization of those areas altogether. Two supposedly distinct regional populations, the Acadians of the Gaspé Coast and the Saguenayans further inland, turn out to share more identity by descent DNA segments with each other than either shares with the general Quebec population. Evidence of kinship bonds forged early and never fully diluted, even centuries later. The lesson researchers keep relearning, project after project, region after region, is the same one. Wherever French colonial populations in North America turned inward and stayed small, the genome remembers exactly how small and exactly who was really involved, long after the paperwork stopped being reliable. But disease markers were only the beginning. As genetic genealogy technology matured and companies began offering affordable Y chromosome and mitochondrial DNA testing to ordinary people, something else started surfacing from inside Cajun and Acadian family trees, something that had nothing to do with disease and everything to do with identity itself. For generations, the official version of Acadian history told a clean, simple story. French Catholic settlers arrived on Nova Scotian soil, built farms, raised families, and were later expelled by the British. French in, French out. A tidy narrative of European colonization uncomplicated by anyone else's presence. But the DNA tells a messier, richer, and far more human story than that. When the earliest French settlers arrived in Acadia in the early 1600s, they did not arrive into an empty land. The Mi'kmaq people had lived along that coastline for thousands of years, hunting, fishing, and moving with the seasons across the same marshes and forests the French were now trying to farm. And unlike so many other early colonial encounters across North America, the relationship that developed between the French settlers and the Mi'kmaq in Acadia was, for a remarkably long stretch of time, one of alliance rather than conquest. Frenchmen married Mi'kmaq women. Families blended. Children grew up speaking both languages, moving between two worlds that, in this particular corner of North America, for roughly 6 generations, coexisted rather than collided. And then came the Grand Dérangement, and something happened to that story that historians are only now beginning to fully reckon with. As families were torn apart and scattered across the Atlantic world, as survival became the only priority, and as generations passed under the weight of Catholic Church record-keeping that often categorized people strictly along racial and religious lines, the indigenous half of many Acadian family trees began to disappear from the written record. Sometimes it was left out by accident, lost in the chaos of displacement. Sometimes it was left out deliberately, quietly folded away as families rebuilt their lives in new places, where a French Catholic identity offered more social safety than an indigenous one did. Either way, over 2 centuries, the paper trail thinned, and then in many cases, it vanished altogether. Written history remembered the French settlers. It forgot the Mi'kmaq, mothers and grandmothers standing right beside them in the family tree. DNA doesn't forget the way paper does. It was genetic genealogists, working case by case through Y DNA and mitochondrial DNA results submitted by present-day Acadian and Cajun descendants, who began pulling that erased history back out into the light. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down almost unchanged from mother to child, generation after generation, along a single unbroken maternal line, which makes it an extraordinarily precise tool for identifying deep ancestral origins. When researchers began testing descendants of certain early Acadian families and tracing their maternal lines all the way back, they didn't find European haplogroups waiting for them at the root. They found indigenous American ones. Bloodlines running straight back to Mi'kmaq, women who had married into French settler families in the 1600s, women whose names, in many cases, had been erased or altered in the written genealogical record, but whose genetic signature had been quietly passed down, unbroken, through every single daughter and granddaughter for 400 years. One case in particular became something of a landmark within genetic genealogy circles. The story of a woman researchers came to call Anne Marie, an indigenous woman from 17th century Acadia whose descendants had no idea of her existence until DNA testing exposed the maternal line leading directly back to her. Her name had all but disappeared from the historical record. Her DNA had not. Thousands of people carrying documented French Acadian surnames today, people who grew up believing their ancestry was entirely European, have discovered through genetic testing that they carry a direct, unbroken maternal line back to an indigenous woman whose story colonial record-keeping tried, whether through neglect or intention, to erase. What makes cases like Anne Marie's so persuasive to researchers isn't a single test result in isolation. It's the pattern of convergence across dozens, then hundreds of separate family lines, all pointing back toward the same handful of early indigenous women, appearing again and again in unrelated Acadian surnames that had no obvious reason to connect to one another on paper. A Blanchard family line and a completely separate Melanson family line, with no documented relationship anywhere in the written genealogy, turning up with matching maternal haplogroups tracing back to the same 17th century point of origin. That kind of independent convergence is exactly what genetic genealogists look for when trying to distinguish a real historical event from a coincidence or a testing error. One matching line could be chance. Dozens of matching lines surfacing independently across family trees that never crossed paths in any surviving document is a signature, and it is one that researchers dedicated to Acadian ancestry projects have now spent nearly 2 decades compiling, comparing, and quietly confirming one DNA kit at a time. The tools making this possible didn't exist when the first generations of Acadian genealogists began their work. For most of the 20th century, tracing a family line meant physically traveling to parish archives, sifting through fragile baptismal and marriage registers written in formal 17th and 18th century French, and hoping the priest who kept the records had been thorough and honest about what he chose to write down. Autosomal DNA testing changed that equation entirely. Suddenly it became possible to test hundreds of documented or suspected descendants of a single Acadian family line, compare their raw genetic data against one another, and see, in cold statistical terms, whether the paper trail actually matched the biology. In many cases it did, and those matches gave genealogists enormous confidence in centuries of careful archival work. But in a meaningful number of cases, it didn't, and those mismatches turned out to be exactly where the buried Indigenous maternal lines were hiding, tucked quietly into a family story that had been told the same way, generation after generation, without anyone ever thinking to question it. This changes the entire picture of who the Cajun people actually are at a biological level. The story isn't simply French peasants exiled from Canada who rebuilt their world in a Louisiana swamp. The real story, the one written into the genome rather than the church register, is of two peoples who merged together in the marshes of early Acadia, whose combined descendants were then violently scattered by a British expulsion, and who carried that blended ancestry with them, often unknowingly, all the way to Louisiana, where it settled into the bayous alongside everything else that would eventually be called Cajun culture. And the genetic isolation didn't stop once the Acadians reached Louisiana either, which is part of why this ancestral signal remains so clear and so traceable today. In the swamps and prairies of southern Louisiana, Cajun communities continued marrying largely within themselves for generation after generation, a pattern geneticists call endogamy. Genealogists working within these family networks today often describe a strange and very telling phenomenon. When they run DNA matching tools designed to separate a person's maternal relatives from their paternal ones, the tools simply don't work properly on Cajun family trees, because nearly everyone in the community is related to nearly everyone else on both sides at once. Distant cousins married distant cousins for so many generations that the very structure of the family tree collapsed inward on itself, folding back into a dense, interconnected web rather than branching cleanly outward the way most family trees do. It is, in the words of genealogists who specialize in this population, less like a tree and more like a net. That density is precisely why the genetic signal, both the disease-causing mutations and the buried Indigenous maternal lines, has remained so strong and so identifiable across 4 centuries. In a population that had mixed freely with outsiders, generation after generation, ancient genetic signatures would have been diluted down to statistical noise within a few hundred years. But the Cajuns didn't mix freely. They turned inward, again and again, first out of necessity as isolated, refugees rebuilding their lives from nothing, and later out of culture, language, religion, and simple geography, tucked away in bayou country far from the major population centers of the American South. That isolation, which for so long was treated primarily as a source of medical risk, of elevated disease rates and genetic disorders, turns out to have been something else as well. It was a kind of time capsule. It preserved, intact and legible, a genetic record of exactly who the Acadian settlers really were and who they really married. 400 years after the fact, long after the written documents meant to record that same information had gone quiet. None of this diminishes the French identity that Cajuns have carried proudly for centuries. The language, the food, the music, the Catholic faith, all of it traces back genuinely and directly to those 50 founding French families who crossed the Atlantic in the 1600s. That part of the story was never wrong. What the DNA adds isn't a correction so much as a second half of a story that had only ever been told with one half showing. The Cajuns are not simply transplanted French peasants who happened to end up in Louisiana after a historical injustice. They are the living descendants of a genuine blending of two peoples, European and Indigenous, that took root in the marshes of Acadia before either group had any idea how violently their shared world was about to be torn apart. There's also a broader scientific lesson buried inside this particular founder population, one that extends well beyond Louisiana or Nova Scotia. Human beings like clean stories. We like to believe our ancestry sorts neatly into labeled boxes, French on one side, Indigenous on another, English somewhere else, each box staying separate and legible across the centuries. Real population history almost never behaves that way. It behaves the way the Acadian genome behaves, messy, layered, full of quiet mergers that made perfect practical sense at the time they happened, and then got smoothed over by whichever version of the story proved most convenient to tell afterward. The Cajun case is powerful precisely because it is so well documented on both sides of that equation. Historians have the deportation records, the ship manifests, the parish registers. Geneticists now have the mutations, the haplogroups, the identity by descent segments. And when those two records are laid next to each other, the gaps between them turn out to be exactly where the most important and most human parts of the story were hiding all along. For descendants living today, this discovery lands very differently depending on who you ask. For some, learning through a DNA test that they carry a direct, unbroken line back to an Indigenous woman in 17th century Nova Scotia has been genuinely emotional, a moment of connecting with an ancestor whose existence had been erased from every document their family ever kept, restored to them not through paper, but through the molecules inside their own cells. For others, within the broader field of Acadian genealogy, it has sparked a real reckoning with just how thoroughly colonial record-keeping shaped and misshaped the official version of who their ancestors were. Church registers were not neutral instruments, simply recording facts. They were shaped by the religious and social categories their keepers wanted to preserve. And Indigenous ancestry, especially maternal ancestry, often had no comfortable box to sit inside once families were scattered into new colonial societies that prized a clean French Catholic identity above almost everything else. The disease research and the ancestry research, which began as two completely separate scientific threads, one driven by a doctor puzzling over young cancer patients, the other by genealogists chasing family trees through DNA databases, have ended up converging on the exact same underlying truth. The Cajun genome is not simply French. It is not simply the genome of an isolated founder population that happens to carry a higher than average risk for a handful of rare diseases. It is the genome of a people forged twice. Once in the marriage beds of early 17th century Acadia, where French settlers and Mi'kmaq families quietly became one interconnected community, and again in the brutal furnace of the 1755 expulsion, which scattered that already blended population across an ocean and eventually deposited a portion of it into the swamps of Louisiana, where isolation preserved the whole tangled inheritance almost perfectly intact for the better part of 3 centuries. What makes this story so striking isn't just the science itself, though the science is remarkable in its own right. A rare case where medical research chasing a cancer cluster and genealogical research chasing family trees ended up independently confirming the exact same deep history. What makes it striking is what it says about the limits of written history altogether. For 250 years, the official story of the Cajun people was told, almost entirely through documents, church registers, deportation records, land grants, marriage certificates, and that story, while true as far as it went, was never the whole truth. Because the people writing those documents made choices, consciously or not, about which parts of a family's origin were worth recording and which parts were better left unwritten. DNA doesn't make those choices. It doesn't care about social convenience or religious categorization or the comfort of a tidy origin story. It simply persists quietly, generation after generation, inside every cell of every descendant, waiting for someone with the right tools to finally go looking. There is a reason this particular piece of hidden history resonates so strongly with people far outside Louisiana, even those with no Cajun ancestry of their own. It touches something universal about how families forget and how families remember. Every long-established community carries pieces of its own past that got quietly dropped somewhere along the way. An ancestor whose religion didn't fit the family's later identity, a marriage nobody wanted recorded, a name deliberately left off a register because writing it down felt dangerous or shameful in whatever era that decision was made. The Acadian and Cajun story simply happens to be one of the clearest, best documented examples of that universal pattern, because the scientific tools now exist to actually prove what was lost, rather than just suspect it. Most families never get that kind of confirmation. Most erased ancestors stay erased. The Cajuns, almost by historical accident, ended up as one of the rare populations where medicine, genealogy, and genetics all converged at once, driven first by a doctor's confusion over young cancer patients and later by ordinary people, simply curious enough to spit into a tube and mail it off, curious enough to finally ask the question their great-great-grandparents' generation never had the tools, or perhaps the safety, to ask out loud. That's ultimately what happened here. A doctor noticed something strange in his clinic. Geneticists went looking for an explanation and found a founder population hiding in plain sight. Genealogists, working case by case through mitochondrial and Y chromosome results, found an entire erased maternal history waiting patiently inside the DNA of people who had no idea it was there. And when all of that research is laid side by side, the picture that emerges is far richer, far more human, and far more complicated than the simple story most people grew up believing. The Cajuns were never just French exiles who rebuilt their world in a Louisiana swamp. They were, from the very beginning, two peoples who became one, whose descendants carried that fused identity through an ocean crossing, a forced expulsion, and 3 centuries of quiet isolation in the bayous, all without ever fully knowing the whole truth of who they actually were. The language survived. The food survived. The music, the faith, the fierce sense of family survived. passed down so completely that most Cajuns alive today would have said, without a moment's hesitation, that they already knew exactly where they came from. And in the broadest sense, they were right. But underneath that familiar story, folded into every strand of inherited DNA, a second, quieter history had been waiting the entire time, patient enough to survive 4 centuries of silence, patient enough to wait for the right test, the right question, the right descendant, curious enough to finally go looking. The DNA finally does.